Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, hey, everybody. Thank you for jumping in to join us for this episode on the Kingdoms Podcast. We're joined all the way from Dundee, Scotland by Andy Bannister. Andy, thank you so much for making time to be here today.
It's great to be with you guys today. Thank you for the invite.
Oh, we are super thankful and a tad jealous because Matt and I both aspire to spend more time in the United Kingdom and the rich history and Christian heritage that exists there. So all that to say, we're glad you can call Scotland.
Well, at least as Canadians, right? Unlike our American friends, we have the Queen in common, right?
We do. She's still on our money. She's still on our coins. So yeah, and she's a pretty impressive woman. But we were joking before we fired up the recording, just saying we love the plethora of books Andy has in his background. And if you're watching this interview, you might be just getting to know a bit about Andy. And Andy has done a lot of excellent work in the field of apologetics, traveling around the world. He's spoken in North America, Europe, other places as well, and written a number of really good texts that apply to following Jesus and rationally engaging with our culture, especially a post-Christian culture that in many ways sees the gospel as a myth at best. And so we're really grateful to have Andy with us today because he's got some really good insights to share, we know, as well as talking a bit about his most recent book. But before I give too much away, Andy, would love for you just to be able to unpack your own story for our listeners. To start us off, man, how did you first get involved in apologetics, and how has your journey really taken you to be where you are today, doing what you're doing, writing the books you're writing?
Wow, that is like the $64 million question. So let me answer that in a nutshell, Luke. So it all started for me actually with Muslims. So back in 1997, I hadn't really thought about apologetics at all. And then a guy came to our church and did a seminar on Muslims and reaching Islam. And he described how every Sunday afternoon he was going up to a place in London, England, called Speaker's Corner. It's part of one of our big parks in London, where every day you can stand on a ladder or a soapbox, talk about anything, religion, politics, sport, you know, you'll get a crowd. And he'd figured out there were lots of Muslims there, so he was going and preaching to the Muslims. Well, we got talking after this seminar, and he was very persuasive and very charismatic. And he said to me, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner next week, Andy, and see what we do? So the following week, I went up to London, met him at the train station, and he had not one ladder with him, he had two ladders. I said, well, why have you got two ladders? He went, well, I'm going to stand on one and preach, and you're going to stand on the other and preach. And I went, like, dude, I've never preached on the street before. He went, oh, it's easy, mate, it's easy. Oh, okay, well, I've never talked to Muslims before. Oh, they're easy, they're really easy, nothing could go wrong. Both those things, Luke, were like totally wrong, because I got up that ladder, and the hundreds or so Muslims who were gathered there, they were well practiced in taking Christians down, and it was a road crash. It was a gong show, and I remember kind of getting down from the ladder, thinking, well, they've thrown dozens of objections and issues they have with Christians at me. I had nothing to give back. I literally remember thinking, maybe I need to become a Muslim because they seem to have everything and I have nothing. And I went home on the train, sort of worrying about this. The following day, I went to the local Christian bookstore and told them my sad little story, and they said, oh, what you want is apologetics. I never heard of the word apologetics at that point. It sounded like a breakfast cereal, actually, sort of, something you'd have, healthy fiber and stuff. And anyway, they sold me some books, and I read these books, went back to Speaker's Corner 2 weeks later with answers to every question they'd asked me, and they had new questions. And I was in public all over again. And for the next 3 months, that's the little game we would play. I would go to Speaker's Corner on the weekend and engage Muslims who would deconstruct me. And then I would read in the week to kind of catch up. But over those 3 months, God did a number of things. He gave me a love of public proclamation of the faith, gave me a love of engaging with people's questions, and a love of Muslims, actually really engaging with them. And to cut a very long story short, one thing led to another. That eventually was set me on the path to studying and led to seminary. I didn't know when to stop, so I started a degree and ended up with a PhD in Islamic studies. So I just kind of kept going, really. And then eventually I got hired by an organization called Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. Obviously, that sort of exploded in rather drastic fashion. in the last couple of years. But when things were going well, I was part of that and leading the Canadian team. So I love Canada. Know where you guys are really well. And then I left that organization in 2016, came back to the UK and came to Scotland, where a friend of mine had started this really kind of tiny organization called Solas, but he was also a pastor and hadn't really got time to develop it. So I took over the reins and we grew the team here. And now we're a small but wide-reaching organization that covers the UK, really seeking to take the gospel out of the four walls of churches and into the public square, universities, schools, cafes, pubs, those kind of places, coffee shops, and then teaching and training Christians how to share their faith more actively with their friends. But it all began up a ladder at Speaker's Corner.
Oh, so good. And I'm intrigued to ask, and who was your partner in crime on the other ladder?
The other guy on the ladder was a guy that, depending on how, sort of widely people listening to this podcast watch things, a guy called Jay Smith.
I knew it. Yes. Okay. I wondered. He spoke at my college in 2011. I was going to be like, was it Jay Smith? It sounds like.
Which college was that, Luke?
Houghton College in New York State.
Oh, Houghton. I've taught at Houghton because I was Mike Pierce. Was taught me undergrad theology.
Wow.
So if you listen to the podcast, this is a let's catch up with old friends. So Jay Smith and Islam, and you'll get lots of really great debates. He's a debater, and does it really well. So there we go.
A firecracker. Yeah, super guy to listen to. For listeners, if you've ever had the chance, or if you want to, definitely engage with Jay Smith.
Check him out.
He's excellent.
That's great. Now you're kind of like relating the story to us of when you were younger and God sort of took hold of your life. And Apologetics, that interaction in that Christian bookstore was a significant interaction. We see a crisis today of many young people leaving the faith and many young people even questioning their traditional faith and trying to sort of navigate that. How might Apologetics help, the regular person who's tuning into this podcast?
Well, that's a brilliant question, Matt. And I remember when I was in Canada from 2010 to 2016, based, down the road from you in Toronto. Yeah. And I remember sometime in that period, I forget exactly when, the Hemorrhaging Faith report came out, if you remember that, looking exactly that question. And what was interesting, lots of studies had picked up the fact that particularly, young adults and students were kind of leaving Christianity and abandoning it. What was interesting, that report did quite a bit of work on, okay, those who are staying, what are some of the factors that play into people holding on to their faith through those college and university years? And I remember there were three things that really stood out to me, maybe more than three, but three really stood out. One was apologetics, was being part of a church where, people are encouraged to ask their questions. If you've got a doubt about what you believe, you don't have to feel that you can't ask it. You can ask it. So anything that churches can do to encourage that. So I've got one or two friends who are pastors, for example, who will even put Q&A at the end of their sermons and encourage anybody who's got a question, just ask it, get it out there. So I think that's crucial. And then young people begin to see, actually, you know what, it's okay to have questions. It's okay to wrestle with these things. There are good answers. Sometimes those answers take work to get to, but Christianity is rigorous. And then the other two things that really intrigued me that came out in that report were giving people the experience of kind of some kind of short-term mission. Because I think there's a number of reasons why I think that's important, but it struck me that you can grow up in a church in the UK or in Canada or America, and if you're not careful, you think the Christian world is just this you and your church and your town, and you don't realize it's bigger than that. And anything I think that can help you see that actually Christianity is global. In fact, the majority of Christians now are not in the Northern Hemisphere, they're in the Southern Hemisphere. There are Christian brothers and sisters in Africa, India, South America, and Middle East and so forth, places where it's a darn sight tougher to be a Christian. And I think the more that we can appreciate that Christianity is not some tiny Western thing, but this global thing with this huge reach, I think that again gives you confidence that you're part of that thing that's much bigger. Think of the Book of Hebrews, that great cloud of witnesses surrounding you. Yeah. And then lastly, and I think this is hugely ties in slightly to the first one, Hemorrhaging Faith picked up on the importance of folks being part of a church where there really is transparency, where they see the gospel lived out, warts and all. When things go wrong, they're not swept under the carpet. Church leaders don't pretend everything is perfect when it's not perfect. Let's talk about when things go wrong. Let's talk about the things we struggle with as Christians. Be real with one another. And when people see real Christianity demonstrated, that authenticity is important. But yeah, apologetics is a big part of that mix.
That's an interesting response, even just in the sense that all of those things are an apologetic. to the person who's questioning their faith. Like transparency can be an apologetic to somebody who's doubting. Being able to ask questions is a real apologetic to the doubting heart. That's very interesting. You were not just talking about like heady philosophical answers to questions. Something as simple as transparency. That's wild.
Let me just press into that, Matt, because I think that's absolutely crucially important that we realize that, because I think a couple of things going on. Sometimes I think apologetics has this reputation for being, you say, very head knowledgey. So, firstly, people may not be familiar with the word, outside the bubble of, people listening to this podcast often are, obviously are, because that's what you talk about. But I often come across people who have no idea what it means. And then, of course, it's got this association with sort of philosophy and rational argument and stuff. And that's all fine. That's hugely, hugely important. But I think it's also vital that we realize that the majority of questions being asked these days are not actually those sort of traditional intellectual ones. If I go onto a university campus here in the UK, and I think the same is probably true for Canada, and you stick an event on, called Does God Exist? You might get half a dozen people, but that's not really a question people are asking. But if you put on a question looking at things like meaning or identity or sexuality or purpose or significance or justice, you can pack rooms out, because those are the questions that people are asking. And I think the best apologetics has always listened to the questions that people are really, really asking. And then as you've answered them, try to engage not just the mind, but engage the mind, engage the heart, and engage the imagination. And I always say to Christians, why is it that even today, the probably most influential apologist of the last 100 years or so is probably C.S. Lewis? Most Christians have read something by him. He's still a fairly well-known name outside of the Christian church, particularly you mentioned the Narnia stories. Why was Lewis so influential? Because he got those three. He got the head. He was a brilliant philosopher. He got the heart, but he particularly got the imagination. And we need to make sure we're engaging those three levels. Otherwise, we're going to do people a disservice.
Yeah, and I love that, because it's exciting to consider the reality that our faith in God launches us into those spheres, and that, as Matt was touching on a moment ago, that there can be an apologetic that maybe is very academic. There can be an apologetic that looks like practically loving your neighbor, which in Canada these days, that would be something like snow blowing their driveway, but different things for different parts of the world, right? But how we live out our faith in intangible ways that invites people to see not only the truth, but the goodness and beauty of God and his ways. So
it's the snow blowing thing I miss. Although, funny you say that, I read the story this morning, just a complete aside. I don't know why. It's a snowblowing thing. Made me think about it. Of some Christian who decided that their act of service was they snowblow in their own drive and got very excited and carried away and thought, well, they're going to snowblow their neighbour's drive as an act of service. They hadn't realised that the neighbour had their hose out on the garden hose out underneath the snow, so just proceeded to cover the entire lawn in bits of shredded rubber, kind of thing. So that didn't go down quite so well.
It's the thought that counts.
It is the thought that counts. There you go. That's the thought for today. Remove the hose before snow blowing the lawn.
Yeah. Solid. Well, hey, we want to pivot with you, Andy, just in that you recently wrote and published a book called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God, which is something I appreciate. Yeah, right there on your screen. Matt's got our copy there. And what I appreciate about that is that I think it can often be a part of a bigger question where there can be a perspective in our culture today that says, all roads lead to the summit of the mountain, or all pathways, lead to heaven. And obviously that's probably a bigger book. And so for you to tackle specifically looking at Islam and Christianity is still really valuable, because I know there's arguments that you're putting forward that can reach into it and color some of those other conversations with other faiths. But you set out kind of some key differences between Islam and Christianity, and really make an argument for why you believe Christianity is true. But before we really dive into a comparison with some of our other questions, I would love to just ask, how have Muslims and Christians influenced or worked together in the past in positive ways? And would you say, looking at whether it's the Muslim faith or even some of the culture that's built around that, would you say there's some things that Christians might be able to glean from their history or their culture?
Yeah, what a brilliant question. I mean, I think the first thing I would say, I said in that question you asked me earlier about, my journey into apologetics. But, I use that phrase. I just, loved Muslims through that engagement up in London. And one of the things to this day I love about engaging with Muslims, and I think it's just such a positive thing, is if we're talking to our secular friends, starting conversations about faith can be tough. Starting a conversation with a Muslim friend about faith is not difficult. You may then very quickly get into some quite deep waters, but our Muslim friends, they believe in God. They believe in scripture. They believe in heaven and hell. They believe in prophets, all those things. Now, they may have some very different beliefs about them, but I love engaging Muslims and equally folks from other faiths too. It's a very refreshing change dealing with sort of, the kind of acidic skepticism that's everywhere in our culture. That's the first thing I would say. Second thing I think we can learn from Muslims. Our Muslim friends are often much more willing to be, open about their faith in a way that Christians aren't. Now, not all of them are, because not every Muslim is the same. You'll meet some Muslims who prefer to keep their faith a bit quiet and hidden away, but a lot of Muslims are quite public. They're not, if they're not worried about, dressing Islamically or looking Islamic or being more obviously Muslim. And again, I think there's a challenge there to us, as Christians who I think have been a bit sort of allowed ourselves to be a bit sort of browbeaten again by the secular culture that faith is a private thing. Or, in Islam, there's no such that idea just doesn't compute. It makes no sense that faith is a private thing. So I say they've got it right on that, and we should learn from them, I think, and be much more public in our faith and not be ashamed of it. And actually, sometimes in some settings, I've actually lent on Muslims to support that. Because, if I often say to Christians in the workplace, if you happen to mention you're a Christian and someone has a go at you, go, oh, so you must be, you must have some very sort of outdated views on marriage, for example. You go, oh, you mean like Muslims? That often brings the conversation right to a halt at that point, because it's often Christians who get it in the neck because we don't believe in, for example, same-sex marriage. But, when you point out that the world's billions of Muslims don't believe in either, suddenly often criticism goes away slightly. So I think there's some common ground there. And then the other common ground I say with Muslims is, all of us are concerned about secularization. Muslims, look at a secularizing society and some of the decisions and ways that, Canada or the UK or America have gone morally, and would share our concerns. And I think that's a great starting point. It's not the end point. We don't just simply want to huddle together and go, isn't the secular world terrible? But again, as a way of building some common ground to start from, that's not a bad thing at all. So it's a great question. I think always look for what you can be positive about in the other. We always want to build bridges. And if you're going to build a bridge, you've got to find something on the other side of the ravine that you've got to start from. You don't want to leave them there. You want to bring them across to the Jesus side, but you've got to at least find something there. And so, in the scriptures, for example, I'm always very taken with Acts 17, which is where, Paul is in Athens, wanders around Athens, seeing all these, statues and idols. And you'd have expected Paul as a good Jew to get very outraged at the idolatry, but he doesn't. He's very positive, actually. He compliments the Athenians on their religiosity, and he says, I noticed this statue you had, this altar to the unknown God. Let me tell you about who that God is. Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting missiological model for engaging with folks like Muslims. Find the things where, just like Paul does, we can gently affirm without embracing the whole thing, and then say, let's start from there, and then bring people across to Jesus.
That's great. So there's this idea that there are some areas where, we share likeness, but that we also have to really consider what those differences are. And you do such a great job in your book of highlighting those. And in Canada, we have this long-standing virtue that we have talked about as a virtue, and you challenge that, that we like to think of as tolerance, where we have differences, but we don't really talk about them. Like you've said, a lot of Christians even hold this, where we keep quiet about our own views and values. You spend time in your book really referring to this. You've called it the elephant in the room. And why do you think that it's so important to seek out certainty and truth when it comes to religion?
Well, to be fair to the Canadians, and I'd say I lived there for 6 years, so I love the culture tremendously. We have the same thing in the UK. So I think there's a couple of things I think that's important, Matt. Firstly, I think it's helpful to deconstruct tolerance, because as I point out in the book, I don't think tolerance is a helpful word. Actually, it's always helpful to point out, what are the things that we tolerate. We generally tolerate things that are beneath us but can't do any better. So when the dog wheezes on the couch for the 3rd time in a month, well, we tolerate it. It's a dog, When my 4-year-old son was going through a habit of drawing on everything in sight, you tolerate it. He's a toddler. But with adults who are intellectually equal, saying to someone, "Oh, I tolerate you," I cannot think of a more just a more cynical, sarcastic, degrading term. Quite frankly, most of us don't want to be tolerated. We want to be respected. And so actually recognizing their differences does that, is the first thing. Secondly, I'd also say to people, I think the sign of a true friendship is you can disagree. If you genuinely feel that you can't disagree with someone you're talking with, a friend or a neighbor or a colleague, then you've got no friendship that we're speaking of. Because a good friendship, I think my closest friends are people I can, play sport with, go hill walking with, whatever, and we can argue. You can't do that. I don't think you've got a relationship. And then in terms of truth, I think the other thing I'd say there, Matt, is I think what's interesting, the tolerance stuff, people play around with it when it comes to ethics, and they play around with it when it comes to spirituality. But in every other area of life, we know it is utter, complete rubbish. If you went to see your family doctor and, with a medical condition, and they diagnose it and they say, well, I'm afraid you've got this terrible condition that if we don't treat right is going to kill you. And you say, well, okay, doc, what do I need to do? And the doctor says, oh, gosh, I wouldn't dream of telling you what to do. That would be awfully prescriptive. Tell me your truth. And, we'll do that. I mean, what do you want to do? Do you want to come around to my desk and help yourself with some tablets? Do you want to try some yoga? I mean, whatever works for you. You wouldn't be going, oh, what a progressive doctor. You'd go, I've got my physician's an idiot. I want, can you get professional in the room? Or if you're, flying on an aircraft, you take your flight from Toronto to Vancouver, and the pilot says, I'm going to ignore the laws of aeronautics. I'm going to make my own truth up as we come into Vancouver. You wouldn't board that thing in the first place. So I find myself thinking, why is it when it comes to the areas of religion and spirituality and ethics, we go wibbly wobbly? I don't fully know the answer, but I do wonder if deep down we're not confident in what we actually believe. That when you're confident in what you believe yourself, you're able to defend it, and B, of course, you're able to respect others. In the sciences, 2 scientists are perfectly able to disagree about something and not kill each other. And I think the same is true in religion. I've had some wonderful disagreements and dialogues and discussions and debates with Muslims over the years, and we've remained friends. I mean, just the other week at Dundee University, just my local uni, we had a Muslim Christian dialogue event. There was me, there was a local imam. We had a pretty robust dialogue. It was a fun evening, but I hope we modeled to the students there that he and I could profoundly disagree, but we shook hands afterwards. We had a laugh and a joke afterwards. We got on well, but because he believed clearly, I believed clearly. So I think so for Christians particularly, if you're not willing to actually defend what you believe, I would gently ask the question, do you really believe it? Because Christianity isn't a piece of advice or a little self-help program. It's a piece of good news. And of course, news is only good if, number one, is actually true, and number two, the piece of news, actually means the thing that you think it means. Yeah. And it's interesting, the first Christians, when they chose the word to describe their new message, they didn't go for advice or philosophy or theology even. They picked gospel, which means good news.
Yeah. Oh, true say, man. True say. Well, with all that in mind, we'd love to take a few minutes to delve deeper into your most recent book and to think through some of those comparisons, maybe some of those points of respectful disagreement that you've touched on a moment ago. And so when you look at scripture, at the biblical scripture and the Quran, what would you say are the key differences between the way the Quran and the Bible depict who God is? And how does this then highlight not only the truth of the biblical vision, but also the beauty and the goodness of God?
Oh wow, that's a whole 2-hour kind of lecture in itself, Luke. But let's have a quick go. So the first thing, actually, just before I answer that, just is worth saying that obviously the question that I zero in on in the book is, we can easily get distracted when we talk to our Muslim friends because we assume, well, they believe in God and we believe in God, therefore it's the same God. And of course, the jump in that slide is we haven't stopped at any point and said, what do you mean by the word God? If you take sort of a committed capitalist and a committed socialist, they both believe in politics, but you'd be an absolute fool to believe that Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau believe in exactly the same thing. Very different, utterly different men, but they both believe in politics. You simply have to say, well, okay, what do you mean by the word politics if you were talking to either of them? And the same is true when it comes to belief in God. People use the word God, but mean very different things by that. And so I think both the Bible and the Quran are not actually primarily concerned with the question, is there a God? Both books assume it. Rather, the question is, what kind of God are we talking about? And so what I do in the book is set out to show, well, here are the characteristics that are core, that are fundamental to the Bible's understanding of God. And I pick 5. I say in the book the fact that God is relational. He's a God who can be known. He is a God who is holy. He is a God who is love. And he is a God who has demonstrated that love through suffering in the person of Jesus. And then I turn over to the Quran, and I show that actually for each of those 5 characteristics, either the Quran denies that characteristic outright, or it completely ignores it and puts something else in its place. And the more you do that comparison, the more you come to the conclusion, look, this cannot be the same God that we're talking about, in the same way that if, as we just chatted about a few minutes ago, we have Houghton College in common. And if I'd said to you, oh yeah, I had a friend down there, by this name, and turned out you had a friend by the same name, and we initially thought it's the same person, but we begin talking about our friend Pete, and it turns out my friend Pete is 6 foot, your friend Pete was 5 foot, my friend Pete was very sporty, your friend Pete wouldn't get out of bed if you paid him, the list goes on and on and on. How many differences would we have to get before we conclude that, yeah, Luke and Andy may both have known someone called Peter at Houghton College, but we're talking about somebody different. And I think the same is going on when it comes to the Quran and the Bible. And then what I actually do in the book is I go through those comparisons. And one sense, I don't argue initially for the truth of the Christian presentation of God. I'm really trying to set the differences out. But at the end of the book, as we come in to look at who Jesus is, I make the point that all of those characteristics, that God is relational, can be known, is holy, is love, has suffered. Of course, they're there in the whole of the scriptures. They're there in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but we see them most clearly in the person of Jesus. And what demonstrates that Jesus was God himself in the flesh, well, were the claims that he made, but then the fact he made those claims, but then they were vindicated by him rising dramatically from the dead. And I tend to think that people who rise from the dead have pretty high credibility. So it's the fact the resurrection vindicates Jesus's claims, and Jesus's claims really demonstrate beautifully, what it means that God is all of those things.
Yeah, that's so helpful, especially as we think of that God is not just true, that the biblical picture of who God is not just the most true one out there, but even in pointing us to Jesus and his death on the cross and atoning sacrifice, that's a good God, that's a loving God, that's a kind God. And I think when I think of apologetics, and as we were talking before, that it's not just these heady philosophical arguments, but there are arguments that hit the heart and hit the imagination. And the scripture definitely does that. The biblical picture of who God is definitely does that. In discussing, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, it's all you.
I was really going to say, no, just affirming that, Matt, you're right. And I think, I suppose at the risk of being slightly cheeky, I mean, an argument never saved anybody. If God had simply sat up there, I think it's interesting, particularly given, we live in a world of suffering and pain. I think the COVID pandemic has made that clear to more people than ever. Many of us who live quite comfortable lives have had that comfortability shattered somewhat in the last 2 years. Well, given the kind of world we live in, that needs more than an argument. God could have sat up there in heaven and told us what he thinks about injustice. Well, that's the God of the Quran, who tells you what he thinks, doesn't do anything. The God of the Bible, yeah, he tells you what he thinks, but then far more than that, he does something about it. And to me, I mean, if I was only allowed to take one scripture text to a desert island, I think I would take Romans 5, verse 8. God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. There's so much in there, but that word demonstrates. Love can't just be talked about. It's not good enough just to say, I love you. Love requires demonstration by its very nature. And the God of the Bible has done that in the person of Jesus. And I think all apologetics needs to focus that way. And quite frankly, any apologetic that doesn't come into land on Jesus and the cross, I'm not even sure if it deserves the title Christian. But it might be an interesting philosophical exercise. Apologetics at its best delivers us, as it were, to the foot of the cross.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that. you know, our vision of who God is certainly affects how we see ourselves. And in discussing the difference between the portrayal of humanity in the Bible and the Quran, you've wrote the loss of the loss in the Quran and the Islamic traditions of the concept of the meaning of humanity bearing God's image has some major implications because so much stands on this idea. Most significantly, the whole edifice of human rights and the passionate insistence that every person, no matter his or her race, gender, religion, or background, has inherent value and dignity. How does this image of God in the biblical narrative shape our view of one another? And maybe we can even think of like our society and how it's based on that sort of principle. And then what happens when we lose that? And maybe you can also speak to our society and how we're losing that.
Oh gosh, you guys ask some amazing questions. Yeah, well, okay, so in the Bible, of course, the idea that we're, you know, I'm exploring there in the book, and it's behind that question, of course, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, we have those famous words where it talks about God creating humankind in his image, male and female, he created them, in the image of God, he created them. And the idea that human beings bear the image of God, or what theologians who like to use fancy words because it makes them feel they're earning their paycheck, would call the Imago Dei, the image of God. I mean, yeah, that's absolutely crucial, because running through the whole of the biblical narrative, that underpins the idea that we are not just the stuff of which we are made. And of course, then when you come into the medieval period and the beginnings of the human rights, you know, what became human rights, and the human rights story really goes back to you know, when the Spanish were conquering and colonizing South America in the sort of 14 and 1500s, perhaps a little bit later. Very quickly it became a problem because Spanish colonists were badly mistreating Spanish natives, and word got back to the Spanish authorities, and the Spanish king convened an assembly of sort of theologians and jurists and went, okay, we got to sort this out because we're basically getting a bad reputation internationally because of what's going on here. And it was those theologians that were convened as they began reflecting on this who really began first advancing those arguments and said, well, hang on, just read the Bible. It's very clear that everybody, whether they're Spanish or, you know, South American, everyone bears the image of God and therefore has value and dignity. And interesting, that idea found its way from that debate, then eventually found its way through people like John Locke and others into the American sort of discussion. And they're, you know, obviously baked into the founding documents of the American nation. You have this idea that all men are born free and equal. But of course, you look at that from a secular point of view, and this is, I think, the crisis our society is running into now. It makes perfect sense on a Christian perspective to talk about human rights. But you take that Christian story away, then it makes little sense to say all human beings are born free and equal. They're demonstrably not born equal. Some people are rich, some are poor, some are powerful, some are less powerful, some are thick, some are clever. How do you find a common basis for equality? And it's really interesting, Matt, how many secular writers have picked up on this. So famously, Tom Holland, the British historian, in his book Dominion, that made a lot of waves, you know, a couple of years ago, you know, has the whole book really is exploring the implications of that idea for the whole of Western culture. And, you know, Christians get quite upset about the way our culture has become, you know, to use that phrase, woke. But that wokiness of Canadian culture is actually, ironically, thoroughly Christian. Because if somebody stands up and says, you know, I've invented, you know, a new form of gender and this is who I am, why do we take them seriously? Well, we take them seriously because we believe they're made in the image of God, and we believe their ideas should be treated with dignity, and we should listen to them. And even people who haven't got the Christian tools to understand what they're doing are standing on a Christian foundation. Or someone like Luc Ferry, the French atheist philosopher, in his book A Brief History of Thought, talks about the fact, he says that, you know, in the ancient world, it was taken as a given that some people were superior to others. Every nation that we ever know of has practiced slavery. You know, the Romans practiced it, the Greeks practiced it, the Aboriginal peoples in North America practiced it. Where does he said, does we get this idea that that's a wrong way to proceed? He said, it's a thoroughly Christian idea, and one that as an atheist, I'm grateful for. So I think, yeah, all of our modern, you know, love of human and passion for human rights actually goes right back to the idea of the Imago Dei. And Islam removes it. It's not there in the Quran. And it is no accident, I think, and I talk about this in the book, that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was first sort of ratified on the 10th of December 1948, I think was the date, It wasn't long after that that a lot of the Muslim states began protesting and saying, well, hang on, there are some things in here, particularly around freedom of religion and the value of women, that we don't agree with. And they came out with the Islamic statement on human rights that waters down some of those things. So I think as Christians, we need to lean into that, not with a sense of superiority. This is not about Christians going out and going, hey, shut up, we're amazing. Christians sometimes have not failed to follow through on those implications. The legacy of the church is not always a good one, but we should be standing there saying, yeah, we do think humans have value and dignity and significance, and the reason we think it is because we're made in God's image, and that is a uniquely biblical idea, unique to Judaism and Christianity.
Wow. Well, to continue in delving into this most recent work of yours, the Christian faith is founded on the hope that Jesus ultimately offers through his life, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. And so I'm intrigued to know, how does the Muslim view view Jesus? Sorry, how does the Muslim faith view Jesus, and what hope does it offer humanity in light of the reality of suffering and struggles and adversity that we all experience?
Well, to begin with the latter half of that question, Luke, I would say with the very greatest respect to my Muslim friends, I think Islam is a hopeless religion. And there's a deliberate pause between those two. It's not a hopeless religion, a hopeless religion, because there is no ultimate hope in Islam. Firstly, if you read the Quran, there is nothing done by Allah, the God of the Quran, to deal with the root cause of sin and suffering. So God in the Quran, gets very angry with humanity because humanity forgets and breaks his laws. That God's given us commands according to the Quran. We've broken those commands because we're weak and forgetful. So what does God do in the Quran? He gives us yet more laws and commands. He just gives us more of the same. In fact, I often say the Quran's attempt to solve the problem of humanity is rather like you or I seeing a man drowning in a lake, and to help him out, we offer to throw him a bucket of water. He's already got enough water to deal with, so we just offer to show him more of the stuff. Well, if the problem is, I say to Muslims, that we can't keep God's commandments, then getting more of the darn things doesn't help. Something has to change our inward tendency, to break any law that we come across. And so in that light, I think the Christian understanding, the biblical understanding that actually our very natures have become corrupted through sin, and we don't just need advice and suggestion, we actually need a savior, we actually need a rescuer, not just somebody giving us commands and instructions and motivational quotes. And of course, that's what's on offer in the person of Jesus. Now, Jesus is interesting because he's a connector between Christianity and Islam. Well, not many Christians may know that the Quran talks about Jesus, because when Muhammad was preaching and teaching what became the Quran, he picked up bits of religious tradition that were flying around, including some Christian stuff. And so the Quran mentions Jesus about 20 times. There's about 90 verses that deal with him. But the Quranic Jesus is a bit of an enigma. On the one hand, the Quran wants to assert that Jesus is just another prophet. He's not the divine Son of God. He's nothing special. And so time and time again, the Quran will say, he's just another prophet. He's like all the others. There's no distinction between them. So everything gets flattened out. But on the other hand, you read what the Quran says about Jesus. He's the only Quranic prophet born of a virgin. The Quran is obsessed with the virgin birth. 2 long renditions of the story of the virgin birth. So why has he got a virgin birth? That's fascinating. He does these amazing miracles. He opens the eyes of the blind. He heals lepers. He raises the dead. No one else in the Quran does those things. And then the Quran gives these lofty titles to him. He's a word from God. He's a spirit from God. He's the Messiah. And then the Quran also alludes to the fact, and later Islamic theology develops the idea that Jesus is coming back at the end of history to fight the Antichrist and be involved at the end of all things. So the Quran can't make its mind up. And I think what's going on is Muhammad has borrowed Jesus, but he's basically too big. He doesn't fit into the Quran. In fact, in my book, I sort of somewhat flippantly make the point, it's rather like reading Jesus in the Quran is rather like someone taking Gandalf from Lord of the Rings and inserting him into Pride and Prejudice, the Jane Austen novel. It would break the whole story. And Jesus just breaks the Quranic framework. He refuses to be just another prophet because he's in the wrong story. And so I always say to Muslims, you need to read the story where Jesus fits, rather than just be content with him sort of breaking the boundaries of the Quran. We need to ask why he does that. And you need to look at the Bible, where all those things that I would think the Quran gets right. I say to Muslims, actually, the Quran is right. He did raise the dead. He did open the eyes of the blind. He is a word from God. He is a spirit from God, and he is coming back at the end. All those things are actually correct, but they don't work in Islam, because he's been ripped from where he belongs. So we need to encourage our Muslim friends to read the Gospels where Jesus makes sense.
So this is a bit of a hip shot question, so feel free to pull a pass on it. But it's been something that I've considered and wondered about for some time, and I wonder if your expertise might be able to address it in a satisfactory way instead of me just like thinking about it.
Okay.
But as you were talking about that, I had wondered, would you consider, like, even historically, Islam to be something of like a Christian heresy?
Oh, now there's an interesting question. That's not such a strange thing as you might think, actually, Matt. I mean, that argument has been made over the years, that throughout history there were various, to use the long kind of term, Christological heresies, where particularly splinter groups started up, came up with something weird about Jesus and shot off in strange directions. And it does fascinate me. Whenever groups do that, it's always around Jesus. So even today, look at the Jehovah's Witnesses and some of those other sects. It's often Jesus where they branched off and done strange things. And so you could argue our JW friends are effectively a Christological heresy and so on. So Islam could fit into that bracket. The only slight question mark I would have is there's a lot more going on than just Jesus. And the danger is we assume it's just Jesus. I actually think a much more helpful model for understanding Islam is when you think about Muhammad, building Islam out of bits and pieces lying around. It's a mistake to then look too hard at the bits and pieces and assume they make a coherent whole, by which I mean, again, analogies I often find help. So my 6-year-old son loves building Lego bricks, those little plastic toy bricks that you can build things out of. Now, one day he might make a castle. The next day he might take the castle's pieces and turn it into a rocket ship. And if I asked him, oh, so do the knights who lived in the castle yesterday now live in the rocket ship? He'd look at me like I was stark staring mad. There's no narrative connection between the two things. He simply used the pieces lying around. And I think Islam, the same thing is going on. Muhammad didn't stop and think, well, I wonder if Jesus could be this. He went, oh, there's the Jesus story. That works. There's Jonah. That works. There's a bit of Arabian tradition. That works. And so the Quran is assembled out of Lego bricks. And with the result that it looks quite interesting, but the individual pieces don't necessarily make sense. And the danger is then we come along as Christians, assume when the Quran's talking about Jesus, it means the Jesus we're familiar with, rather than, there's a sort of building block marked Jesus inside the wall that is Islam. So I probably wouldn't go for the Christological heresy label, although it does help remind us that Jesus is at the heart of it. And I find that fascinating, that no matter what systems people come up with, often you still come back to that question that Jesus asked his disciples, who asked he asked the crowds, who do people say that I am? That is the central religious question that you can't avoid.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
As we come to the end of this, we just really want to give you an opportunity to let us know where we can find your book. We really encourage people to pick this one up. And if there's anything else that you really want to plug, how can people find out more about you?
That's very kind to ask, Matt. So I've just put up on the screen. So you'll find a link on the screen to SOLAS. That's the organization I run in the UK, SOLAS Centre Public Christianity, and you put /new-book. Actually, we need to update that URL because it's 6 months old. So it's not a new book anymore. It's a slightly older book. And if folks go to that link, what you can do, you can read the first chapter free. You can listen to the first chapter, the audiobook free, and there's links to getting a hold of the book, wherever you are, if you're in Canada or Europe or the US. But also really encourage people to look around the rest of the SOLAS website. We've got hundreds and hundreds of resources there, both for evangelism, but also for sharing with skeptical friends, all free to use. Perhaps the main thing, Matt, I would direct people to is perhaps one of the things that we're most excited that we've done in the last 3 or 4 years. We do a video series called Short Answers, where every 2 weeks we take a question or an objection that somebody might have raised about the Christian faith, and we do a 4 to 5 minute answer. It's not, a definitive answer, and those videos are designed to be super friendly for non-Christians. And we've got videos there, that you can share with Muslim friends, atheist friends, skeptical friends. So really encourage listeners to a show. Check that out. And as I say, it's all free to use. You don't need to ask our permission. You can send people the link if you prefer to download them and stick them on your own channel. For people listening to this, you do all that too. We're just keen so that they get out there and help people talk about Jesus with their friends. So anyway, do give the Solas website a look.
That's great. Sounds like a really good resource. Thank you.
Yeah. Andy, are there any social media pages that we could point people towards to engage with you or Solas?
Absolutely. So what you can do, if people search for me on, we're on Facebook, but I realize given your demographic of 20 to 40-year-olds, that probably sounds like go and check out the Ark. Also find us on Instagram and Twitter. You can search either for Andy Bannister or search for Solas. We are Solas CPC, Centre for Public Christianity is our handle across all social media channels. And in my case, I'm Andy G Bannister, because Andy Bannister already gone. So I'm Andy G Bannister again on most platforms. But if you search for me, certainly search for Solas. It's an unusual word. If you put Solas into the search engines, the first thing you'll find is the safety of life at sea, people. That is not us. Under that, you'll find us. So if you find yourself reading about life jackets and swimming training, you're on the wrong website.
You're on the wrong website.
That's
awesome. Well, Andy, this has been really valuable. Grateful for you, for the work you're doing, for the writing that you're producing, and especially for this time together. So thanks for making time to be with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been a blast hanging out with you guys.